Daniel chapter 2 really gets the story of Daniel going. And here in Daniel chapter 2, we see all four of the big themes in Daniel, as we see in almost every chapter. God reigns as a King of Kings. God reveals mysteries. God redeems as a Son of Man. And God rescues his faithful ones. It's interesting how these themes are throughout the book in almost every chapter. Well, Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 through 24, break the story up into three sections or three movements of the story. And the first is the king and his wise men in fear. The king and his wise men in fear. So Daniel chapter 2, verse 1 starts like almost all the other chapters in Daniel. It starts with a king and a timestamp. It says there in Daniel chapter 2, verse 1, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. So if you remember, we talked about Daniel chapter 1 last week. This is likely immediately after the 3 years where Daniel and his friends have been in their Babylonian school of culture and language, and they'd been presented before the king, and they are 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters of the king's court, but they're young, and they're the foreigners, so they're not in the big leagues yet. At best, they are junior members of the wise men squad, so they are not pulled into this summons we read about in verse 2. So the king commanded that the magicians and the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and they stood before the king, and the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Now, it's hard for us to really appreciate all the cultural things that are going on here, now living 2,600 years later in our Western rationalistic thinking. To appreciate everything that's going on here, you kind of have to get inside the mind of the ancient world in the ancient worldview. In the ancient world, there was no such thing as a separation of church and state. That's causing a lot of issues nowadays, isn't it? In the ancient world, religion and politics were one and the same. And the king of the ancient worldly pagan kingdom was not just a man, he was a man who had connection with the gods. Some cultures saw him as a god, some saw him as one of the gods. He at least had a connection with the gods. And as a man who had to have connection with the gods, he needed to have a good flow of communication with the gods so that when the gods are sending a message through, he was able to get that message. And so, as was very common, we see this in other parts of the Old Testament, the ancient kings of the ancient world had their staff of diviners and magicians and enchanters and sorcerers whose job it was to be their interpreters. We read there in verse 2 that there are 4 classes of these wise men, at least that are presented right here. We have the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans. Now you see in those 4 words different ways that maybe some of these guys did this. It says 4 classes here, but as we read throughout the book of Daniel, the language of the court of ancient Babylon was very wordy. And you see all through Daniel these long lists of names and repeated words, redundant words all the way through the book. And so the Chaldeans, the last name in that list, is probably kind of the summary name for this group of wise men. In fact, we'll see in verse 4 that it's the Chaldeans who are doing the answering. These are the wise men, the counselors, the spiritual advisors, you might say, all right? It is their job to interpret dreams, to divine what the gods have to say, and they would use various means to do this. Now, they would sometimes, just for example, there's a lot of ways they do this, but they would cut open an animal like a sheep, and they would investigate its guts to see what the gods are communicating, all right? That seems kind of silly, but that was one of the ways they did this. They would also interpret dreams, all right? Now, this is a picture of a tablet that was from this time, all right? This was a tablet that was found in a library back there in ancient Babylon. And this tablet represents the type of tablets that have been found that are dream interpretation manuals. All right, you probably didn't realize that in ancient Babylon, they had a whole rack of tablets written in this cuneiform writing where they'd use a little stamp of a little triangle to make triangles in the clay, press it in there, and they would have these dream interpretation manuals. So what they would do is the counselor would hear the dream, and they would get out their stack of interpretation manuals, and they would look up historically what these symbols mean. Now, you might think that's kind of silly. I mean, looking up what a dream means, and that's kind of silly. Maybe that's kind of lame. Well, I tell you what, it's really fascinating that even though this event happened 2,600 years ago, the exact same thing is happening right now. In fact, you can buy all kinds of books. You can look at online dream interpretation manuals to do the exact same thing that these men were doing for King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, of all these dream dictionaries and manuals, I mean, some of them agree, some of them don't agree, and I was just trying to learn a little bit about how this works. So I looked at one online dream dictionary, and I didn't get very far into it. I just stayed in the A's. I didn't want to go through it very far. And so in the A's, I learned this. Now, you probably didn't know this. If you dream about an abalone shell, now I don't know if anybody dreams about abalone shells, but if you dream about an abalone shell, according to this online dream dictionary, that means that supposedly this is something unique in your life that nobody else can have. And I'm kind of thinking, that doesn't really help me that much. I don't dream about abalone shells. I don't know if anybody else does either. But according to that all-wise source, the internet, that knows all truth, right? This is what it means if you dream about abalone shells. Well, these wise men, they didn't have the internet, and they didn't have all these books you can buy on Amazon, but you guys, they had the exact same thing. They had these dream interpretation tablets. Now, what's interesting about the way they would interpret dreams is they were all based on puns or on words that sounded alike in their language. Let me just give you an example. For example, in English, if you dreamed about a pin, according to the way that they would interpret dreams, if you dreamed about a pin, they might say, well, there's safety in the pen that you will be in, or something like that. Another example might be if you dream about an abalone shell, you can say this dream is baloney, If you would say a word, they would find a word that was very close in sound and spelling in their language, and that was how they would interpret the dreams. And that was what these dream interpretation manuals were filled with. Now you're thinking, that's just really, really lame. I know you're thinking that. That's so lame. I mean, interpreting dreams based on puns and stuff like that. Well, guess what? The king also thought that was pretty lame. So the king brings the guys in. Hey, I had a dream. The wise men are like, hey, this is easy peasy. Let's hear it. So this is verse 4 now. They answer him, and listen how they just suck up to the king. The Chaldeans said to the king, and they're speaking in Aramaic. This is the language used here in this chapter. And they're kind of doing their glorifying the king, suck up to the king thing. Oh, king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. Well, this is verse 5 now. Listen how the king says it to them. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word for me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. Verse 6, but if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. So 3 times there in verses 5 and 6, he says, show me the dream and show me the interpretation. King Nebuchadnezzar is no fool. He didn't get where he was. He didn't become the ruler of the ancient world by being an idiot. He is no fool. He has seen this wise men game being played over and over. He's seen him cut open the sheep. He has seen them use the dream interpretation tablets. He has seen this. He's heard it. He's also probably thought the same thing you thought about the interpretations based on puns and words that sound alike. That is so lame. And he's thinking, as the kind of guy who is known for tearing people limb from limb, and as the kind of guy who reduces people's houses to rubble, he also knows that he probably doesn't always exactly inspire 100% accuracy from his wise men staff. I mean, he has seen how they are just yes men and suck-ups, and they don't want to face his wrath, so they want to give him something that he likes. Well, the king says, not this time. Not this time. I'm not going there, because I think that Nebuchadnezzar really knew how important this dream was. And in the ancient world, dreams were very significant to pagan rulers like this. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, in typical powerful kingly fashion, does the threat and reward thing, right? Well, surely these were not empty threats, as we'll see here later on in chapter 2 and also in the rest of the first few chapters of Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar knew, as important as this dream was, he had to have 100% accuracy in interpretation. If someone had the connection with the gods to be able to reveal the mystery of the dream itself, to be able to know what the dream was, then that would be the wise men who had the credentials, who had the credibility, who had the clout to give the correct interpretation. He wasn't going with the lame puns this time. He's going with what will get the absolute 100% right interpretation. So you can imagine the nervous looks that the wise men squad give each other, right? And then I love verse 7. They just completely ignore everything the king just said, and they try again. I mean, this is what they're doing. It was like the king said nothing. So verse 7, they answered a second time and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. Now, I don't think that really helped their situation at all, because you look at verse 8, the king answered and said, I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time, because you see that the word from me is firm. And then verse 9, if you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. That's death, right? He says, you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the times change, meaning they're trying to buy time until maybe he changes his mind later. And then he says again, therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. Now, as pagan and as worldly as Nebuchadnezzar was, he had a very important sense of wisdom here. As important as this dream was, he knew that they weren't going to give him the right interpretation unless they could tell him the dream. So in this second reply, the king just gets more angry at them, and he accuses them of buying time and lying. You know, these wise men probably had never had a situation quite like this before. They didn't realize how important this was to the king. And so they answer him a third time in verse 10. And this time, just being good political suck-ups and yes men they just digress into plain old whining. Verse 10, the Chaldeans answer the king, and they said, there is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. Verse 11, catch this. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. I want you to think about what they just said. And I wonder if the assigned Chaldean wise man, who was the spokesman for all the crowd there, I wonder if he maybe clapped his hand over his mouth even as he said that, and all the other gaggle of wise men look over at him and nod, and they're like, yep, we're toast. What he just said, yep, we're toast, because they just gave away their biggest trade secret. They said, no one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. In other words, the secret's out. Sorry, king, but we don't really communicate with the gods. We act like it. I mean, we look like it, but we really don't. And so, sorry, what you're asking is impossible. It's impossible. Their secret is completely out. Their career as sorcerers and magicians and enchanters and interpreters of dreams, their careers are over. In fact, they believed that their lives were about to be over because they knew no one can reveal this except the gods, and the gods are not one of us. The gods don't live in human flesh. And see, in these few words, the wise men of Babylon uncloaked their whole religious system. And they uncloaked the whole religious system of secular humanism that exists right now today. There is no communication. There is no revelation except that which people make up. That's the sham of the system of humanism and idolatry in all its various forms. There is no communication from the other side except that which we make up. They also introduce a great point of discussion at the same time. If there were a God who took on flesh, if there were a God who took on flesh, well, then he would be able to speak to us. He would be able to reveal the mysteries. He would be able to talk to us face to face, and we could listen, we could hear his voice. Then and only then, O King, would we be able to do what you asked. Our religion of idols and sorcery and magic has been shown to be a sham, just like the religion of humanism in modern day America. It's all a sham. See, these guys, they thought they might be able to fool a fool, and they might be able to con a con, but when it comes down to true revelation, we got nothing. That's what the world tries to offer the people who are looking out there. They try to say, oh, you can find something hidden in the dark recesses of your own heart, but really, they've got nothing. The religion of secular humanism and idolatry is really just a sham. Christian, I hope you're paying attention to this. I hope that you're listening, and if you're listening, you really should be thinking, wait, this sounds familiar, this God becoming a flesh thing. Yeah, that sounds really familiar. Because Daniel's going to reveal the meaning of the dream later on in the chapter. We'll talk about that next week. The meaning of the dream is that God is going to set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. And the way that God's going to set up that kingdom is he's going to become flesh. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Years ago, I think it's about 20 years ago, there was a very popular song, crazy popular song called What If God Was One of Us? Some of you have probably heard that song. It's been redone, remade, it's been put on TV shows. It's still a popular song. It was by one of these artists that they call a one-hit wonder, right? It means the person made this one popular song and then you never heard of them ever again. The one popular song, one-hit wonder. And this was a crazy popular song. It's still popular on the internet, on TV and stuff like this because it asks a question. And it's interesting that the song has enough truth in it to appeal to those with a biblical worldview, but it asks enough questions to appeal to those who have a humanist worldview. The lyrics of the song go, what if God was one of us? Just a slob like one of us. Just a stranger on the bus trying to make his way home. And at the surface, it seems like, it's just kind of a song asking dumb questions. But when you really kind of get into it and you look at the verses, the question that the song asks is actually a very good question. The question is, if God was one of us, would it make any difference at all? Would it make any difference? As Christians, we don't have to ask if God was one of us. We know that God was one of us. The core of our faith is that God was one of us and that he has done all the work so that all of us sinful slobs can receive that which we don't deserve, the perfect holiness and righteousness of God. Colossians 1:19, for in him, in Jesus Christ, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. See, the question really is to the person out there who doesn't understand the Christian faith, did God becoming one of us make any difference at all? I'd suggest to you that it made a lot of difference in all of your lives. That's the reason why you love. That's the reason why you share. That's the reason why you support the community. God, being one of us, made a difference in everything that you do. You know, this episode of the whining, groveling wise men before King Nebuchadnezzar, it really reminds us that Jesus Christ is the wisdom and the power of God. Jesus Christ is the answer to all of the world's problems and all of the world's deepest questions. You know, from the perspective of Daniel, 600 years before Christ, Daniel was pointing us forward to the future coming of Jesus Christ to earth and establishing his kingdom as the greatest and most important of events that would ever happen in the history of the world. And so God becoming one of us would make the difference. It would be the most important thing. It would answer all the questions. It would be God revealing all the mysteries that God wanted to be revealed as the Son of God and the Son of Man. The second part of the story starts in verse 12. Here we read about Daniel and his executioner in wisdom. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious. You hear the redundant words throughout this. It's great. The king was angry and very furious and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. And Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation of the dream. So, as in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel with wisdom and tact, he talks down his oppressor and he's given favor. We read there in verse 14 that Arioch is called the captain of the guard. A more literal translation of that is that Arioch was the captain of the executioner squad. He was the one whose job it was to round up the wise men and bring them to death. So even as junior members of the wise men team, Daniel and his friends are caught up in the king's order. And so we read here in verse 16 that Daniel was able to appeal to the king for a time. Now, this part of this is so amazing to me. We don't have this conversation recorded, how Daniel did this exactly. But surely Daniel used that same tact and wisdom. He didn't whine, he didn't grovel like the other wise men did. And he must have seemed, at some level, hopeful and trusting that God could reveal this dream to him. I want you to think about the faith of Daniel here. He did not know the dream, and he did not know the interpretation. But he had trust enough in God to present himself to the king to give him some time. And so we see in verse 17 the third movement of this story, and here we read about Daniel and his friends in faith. I think that if you really look at this whole chapter, verses 17 through 23 are probably the most important part, because it's the part where Daniel is praying and he's praising God, right? First of all, he prays. Verse 17, so Daniel went to the house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, his companions. And he told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions may not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So Daniel gathers his friends in prayer, and together they sought mercy. And doesn't this stand in great contrast to the way that the groveling, whining Chaldeans went before King Nebuchadnezzar? They're not seeking mercy, they're complaining and whining. Daniel is seeking mercy from God, and that implies that they humbled themselves, they confessed their sin, and they sought the mercy of Almighty God. Daniel prayed a prayer later on in Daniel chapter 9 that surely represents this seeking mercy type of prayer. Daniel 9 verse 18. Oh my God, incline your ear and hear. This is Daniel praying. Open your eyes and see our desolations and the city that is called by your name. He's talking about Jerusalem there. For we do not present our pleas before you because of our righteousness, but because of your great mercy. think that prayer in Daniel chapter 9 represents the type of seeking mercy prayer that we see that they're praying here in Daniel chapter 2. Well, in Daniel chapter 9, Daniel's prayer is answered. Well, also Daniel's prayer is answered here in Daniel chapter 2. Verse 19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So he prayed and he praised. So Daniel answers and says, verse 20, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those of understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you made known to us the king's matter. And so again, we see as in Daniel chapter 1, God is working, God is moving, and Daniel lives in faith. And this is the sum total of what we need to understand of our situation right now, living in modern day Babylon. God is working, and we're living in faith. You know, these 4 themes here in Daniel are exactly the themes of everyday life in modern day Babylon. God reigns. God reveals through his word. God redeems through Jesus Christ. And yes, God rescues. You know, it seems like all the worldly powers have the upper hand. In Daniel, it seems like that. It seems like that right now. But God is working. He's moving the engines of the world by his providence. He's setting up kings. He's setting up kingdoms. And he's removing kingdoms for his own good purpose. And even under the gun, Daniel lives by faith. And so must we today, living in Babylon. We have God's word that has revealed God's plan for the ages. And if you read the book, you know that God wins. So put your trust in Jesus. Not in yourself, not in any earthly kingdom. Don't put your trust in stuff or money or your good looks or your guns. Don't trust in your country's politicians or in your country's military. Put your trust in Jesus. Psalm chapter 20, verse 7 says, some trust in chariots, some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. Modern paraphrase of that might be some trust in guns, some in tanks, but our trust is in the one who will never be defeated. You know, even as we struggle now in the world, here's the good news, Christian. We live in a kingdom that will never be destroyed. It will never be destroyed. And that's the theme of the rest of Daniel chapter 2 as Daniel interprets the dream for the king, and that'll be the focus of our message next Sunday.